Most retirement fear is not born from math, it is born from framing. That is the first thing I want you to understand. A man reads a headline that says $1.5 million is not a finish line. It is a checkpoint. He feels something tighten in his chest. Maybe I am behind, maybe what I thought was strong is actually weak. Maybe retirement is farther away than I believed. Maybe no matter how much I save, the number will keep moving. That is the emotional game, and the emotional game matters because the wrong framing can do more damage than a bad market year. A bad market year hurts your portfolio. Bad framing hurts your belief that freedom is even possible. And once a person loses that belief, he starts making much worse decisions. He delays. He panics. He oversaves without living. He undersaves because the target feels hopeless. He stops trusting his own progress. That is why I care so much about this subject, not because retirement math is glamorous, because retirement fear is one of the quietest forms of modern financial suffering. A lot of people are not failing retirement. They are being psychologically pushed away from it. The source document opens in exactly that territory. It says a widely circulated media framing takes $1.5 million. Something that sounds like success to most ordinary people and turns it into something that feels barely adequate. Then it asks whether that framing is really grounded in the way retirement actually works. That is the correct starting point. Phaephilosite Phaeturn 54, file 0 Phay, because once you understand that, the whole conversation changes. The real issue is not whether inflation exists. It does. The real issue is not whether healthcare costs matter. They do. The real issue is whether the scenario being used to frighten people is internally coherent. And in this case, the source says very clearly that it is not. It is blending different retirements into one blurry model and then acting surprised when the result feels tight. That is bad analysis, and bad analysis becomes expensive the moment people build their lives around it. So let me tell this story the hard way. A lot of retirement media works by stacking conservative assumptions until the conclusion feels scary enough to travel. That is the whole business model: low withdrawal rate, low Social Security assumption, long time horizon, early retirement language, full retirement age benefits, inflation fear, healthcare fear, then present the final number as if it were reality. Number that is not reality. That is a fear bundle. And fear bundles make ordinary savers feel permanently inadequate. Let me give you the master metaphor for this whole conversation. I call it the moving finish line. Imagine a runner on a long road. He has trained, he has endured, he has saved, he has built a very large pile of money. Then just as he approaches the line, somebody picks the line up and moves it 50 yards farther. Not because the road changed, because the commentator changed the story. That is what retirement framing often does. You save 1 million. Then the story says it is not enough. You save 1.5, then it is not enough. You save 2. Still maybe not enough. Soon the point is no longer analysis. The point is emotional destabilization. Because a frightened saver is easier to control than a calm one. A frightened saver clicks more. A frightened saver buys more products. A frightened saver postpones freedom. That is the frame I want you to keep in mind. Now let me show you why the source is right to push back. The first mechanism in this story is what I call scenario blending. The source identifies the article's central mistake immediately. It says the article claims to be evaluating an early retirement, even hinting at 40 years or more of portfolio life, but then it quietly uses average Social Security benefits at full retirement age around age 67 to build the income picture. Those are not the same retirement. Phaephilosite Phaeturn 54 file 0 Phay, that is the whole problem. When you mix early retirement language with standard retirement assumptions, you create a model that sounds conservative but is actually confused. A person retiring at 55 and waiting until 67 for Social Security is solving one problem. A person retiring around full retirement age is solving another. The source is correct to say those are not interchangeable, because time horizon changes everything. Bridge years matter, withdrawal logic changes, sequence matters, and Social Security timing matters enormously. You cannot throw all of that into one bag and call the result a neutral baseline. That is not prudence. That is intellectual sloppiness. And sloppy retirement thinking always punishes the listener more than the writer, because the writer gets engagement, the listener gets anxiety. The second mechanism is what I call false average bias. This is where the article, as described by the source, becomes especially misleading. It takes a $1.5 million portfolio and pairs it with average Social Security, about $24,000 per year, to create a total household spending power around $69,000 using a 3% withdrawal rate. Then it presents that as though it were a realistic profile for the household that managed to accumulate $1.5 million in liquid investable assets by the mid-50s. The source says plainly that this is not a realistic pairing. Phaephilosite Phaeturn 54 file 0 Phay, exactly, because wealth does not happen in a vacuum. A household does not usually arrive at a liquid $1.5 million portfolio in its mid-50s, while living an average earnings history that produces only average Social Security. That can happen sometime. Fine, but it is not the central case. And retirement modeling should be built around the central case, when it is making broad claims. The source then gives a much more grounded earnings picture for households with liquid net worth at that level, especially by the mid-50s. Earnings histories are generally much higher than the national average. It gives typical career income ranges by age group and then builds a deliberately conservative household example around average lifetime household earnings of $125,000, split between one spouse earning around $75,000 and the other around $50,000 using that base. It estimates combined full retirement age Social Security at roughly $56,700 a year, not the $24,000 figure used in the scare framing. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay. That difference is enormous. And once you see it, the whole psychological trick falls apart. Because the bare minimum story depends on forcing the wrong type of worker into the wrong Social Security assumption. That is why I call it false average bias. The average Social Security benefit is useful when you are talking about the average retiree. It becomes deceptive when you use it to model a wealth profile that is very unlikely to be average in earnings history. This is one of the oldest problems in financial media. People take an emotionally loaded number from one group and glue it onto a completely different group because the combination produces a scarier story. That is not insight. That is mood design. The third mechanism is what I call the 3% fear floor. The source says the article assumes a 3% withdrawal rate, producing $45,000 of portfolio income from $1.5 million, and then presents that as the baseline. Then the source pushes back and points to actual retirement research. For a fixed inflation adjusted withdrawal over roughly 40 years, it cites around 4.1% from historical modeling. For more conservative Monte Carlo style forward-looking work, around 3.6%. And for flexible withdrawal methods with guardrails and real-world spending adjustments, starting rates around 5.5% are discussed. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay. This is one of the most important points in the whole file, because the number you choose here is not just a number. It is the emotional thermostat for the entire story. A 3% starting withdrawal rate on $1.5 million says one thing, a 4% rate says something very different. A flexible 5% plus reality says something different again. Now, I am not telling people to be reckless. I am telling them to distinguish between prudence and fear theater. A 3% rule is not some sacred law handed down from heaven. It is an extremely cautious stance, and extremely cautious stances are fine when clearly labeled as such. The problem comes when a very cautious stance is quietly turned into the realistic baseline. That is where retirees get psychologically punished. Because if you assume the lowest spending output from the portfolio, the lowest Social Security input, and then stretch the horizon in the most intimidating way possible, of course the result will look fragile. That does not mean retirement is fragile. It means the framing was built to feel that way. The fourth mechanism is what I call phase blindness. This is where the source becomes really strong. It says most people think of retirement as one giant continuous problem. I have X dollars and I need it to last 30 or 40 years. But that is not actually how retirement functions in many real households. The source proposes breaking retirement into phases. A bridge phase from 55 to 67 where the portfolio does all the work. Then a later phase when Social Security turns on and the problem changes. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay. That is exactly right. Because retirement is not one sentence. It is a sequence. And sequences must be solved in order. The early years before Social Security are not the same problem as the later years after guaranteed inflation. Adjusted income begins. The math changes, the risk changes, the withdrawal logic changes. That is why I call it phase blindness. The media article seems to treat all retirement dollars as though they have one job. That is wrong. Different dollars have different jobs depending on when they are needed. The source then builds the model cleanly at age 55 with $1.5 million invested. Assume a desired lifestyle around $100,000 per year. The bridge phase lasts 12 years until age 67. The source says this is not a 30-year problem. First, it is a 12-year problem first. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay. That sentence is worth a great deal of money, because once a person sees that, he stops mentally crushing all the years together into one giant, unmanageable fear block. Now the job becomes clearer, fund the bridge, then reevaluate once the guaranteed income starts. That is a much more adult way to think. The fifth mechanism is what I call bucket realism. The source proposes two major buckets. A bridge bucket of around $900,000 designed to fund the first 12 years with lower volatility, using combinations of cash, bonds, CDs, and only minimal equity exposure. Then a longevity bucket of around $600,000 designed to remain invested for growth and help fund the later decades. It explicitly says not all dollars in a retirement portfolio have the same job. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay. That is the sentence the whole retirement world should probably tattoo onto its forehead. Not all dollars have the same job. This is where many retirees make themselves unnecessarily miserable. They look at one large portfolio balance and treat every dollar identically. That is a mistake. Some dollars must buy stability. Some must buy time. Some must buy future growth. Some must simply sit quietly and not get dragged into the first decade's spending. This is what bucket realism means. It does not mean buckets are magical. It means retirement gets easier to reason about when the dollars are assigned jobs instead of left in one giant emotional pile. And the source is right that the bridge bucket is not supposed to be a wild growth machine. Its job is defensive. It protects lifestyle. It protects sleep. It protects the retiree from sequence of return panic during the early years. That is a very respectable job for money. Then the longevity bucket gets to do something else. It compounds quietly in the background while the bridge gets consumed. That is not fantasy. That is structure. And structure beats fear nearly every time. The sixth mechanism is what I call Social Security ignition. This is the moment the whole fear story begins to collapse. The source S conservative dual income example says that by full retirement age, the household is receiving roughly $56,700 a year from Social Security alone. That means when age 67 arrives, the retirement problem is no longer, how do I fund $100,000 entirely from the portfolio forever? It becomes, how do I fund the remaining gap after guaranteed inflation? Adjusted income already covers more than half of desired spending. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay, that is a completely different question. And it is a much friendlier question. This is why I get so frustrated with retirement media that tries to keep Social Security in the shadows or shrink it into average numbers that do not fit the actual household being modeled. Because Social Security is not background noise. It is a giant piece of the machine once it turns on. The portfolio no longer has the same burden. The source gives the clean gap math cleanly. Desired spending $100,000. Social Security about $56,700. Portfolio gap roughly $43,000. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay. Now that is a real planning number. That is a number you can work with honestly. At that point, a portfolio around $900,000 to $1.2 million may be entirely sufficient to support the rest, depending on withdrawal method, flexibility markets, and the usual planning realities. The source does the simple translation. At 4%, that gap implies just over $1 million needed. At 5%, around $860,000. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay. That is not panic math. That is retirement engineering. And engineering is what people need, not another moving finish line. The seventh mechanism is what I call spending. Range honesty. This is where the source becomes especially valuable because it stops talking in absolutes. It says that for an early retirement at 55 with $1.5 million, realistic spending might be somewhere around $80,000 to $90,000. On the conservative side, $90,000 to $110,000 on a balanced basis, and potentially $110,000 to $120,000 if the retiree is flexible and willing to adjust when markets underperform. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay, that is the right way to talk. Not because it sounds softer, because it respects real life. A lot of retirement models fail because they assume one spending line forever. That is not how people behave. Spending changes, housing changes, travel changes, healthcare changes, desire changes, energy changes, markets change. People pull back in bad years, they spend more in stronger years. That is not failure. That is adulthood. Rigid fear models treat retirees like robots. Real retirement planning treats them like human beings, and human beings adjust. That matters because flexibility is not a weakness in retirement. It is one of the greatest strengths a household can have. The eighth mechanism is what I call rarity amnesia. This is one of the sharpest moral points in the whole source. It says plainly that a household with $1.5 million in investable assets, excluding its primary residence, is rare company, roughly top 2 to 4% territory, depending on the exact definition and data slice. In other words, this is not a bare minimum household in the social sense. It is an upper-tier liquid household. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 54 File 0 Fay that matters. Not because people should feel smug because words matter. Bare minimum means something, and when media starts calling top-tier liquid wealth bare minimum, it is no longer describing reality. It is manufacturing inadequacy. This is one of the quietest forms of financial harm in modern life. People who have objectively done very well are taught to feel on the edge. People who are merely doing fine are taught to feel failing. People who are truly behind are thrown into despair because the comparison standard becomes impossible. That is why rarity amnesia is such a corrosive habit. It erases scale, it erases context, it erases gratitude, it erases the difference between prudence and paranoia. The ninth mechanism is what I call healthcare fear stacking. The source mentions healthcare as part of the article S. Scary Framing, then later introduces a Medicare advisory sponsor segment I am less interested in the sponsor than in the underlying lesson. Healthcare does matter greatly, but healthcare cost awareness should not be used as a generic emotional multiplier slapped on to every already conservative retirement model just to make the final number look more frightening. Phyphilosite, Phyturn 54 file 0 Phy, that is a very important distinction. Real healthcare planning is necessary. Healthcare fear stacking is lazy. It says, well, healthcare is scary, so let us add it to the pile, fine. But planning means specifics. What premiums, what phase of life, what Medicare timing, what supplemental assumptions, what actual household vulnerability, not just healthcare exists, therefore panic. This is the problem with fear media. It weaponizes true categories without doing the detailed work that would turn those categories into usable planning inputs. The 10th mechanism is what I call retirement authorship. This is the deepest lesson in the file. The source says, fear-based framing is not helpful. It says, what matters is running the numbers on your specific situation. Because once you do that, many things may be more achievable than the media has told you. That is the whole moral point. Phyphilosite, Phyturn 54 file 0. Phy, exactly. Retirement planning is not supposed to be a ritual of humiliation. It is supposed to be an act of authorship. What age do I want to stop? What spending range fits my actual life? What bridge years do I need to cover? What guaranteed income arrives later? Which dollars need stability and which can keep growing? What flexibility do I have? What level of fear is warranted? What level is imported from somebody else's headline? Those are adult questions. Those are authorship questions. They are much better than simply asking, how much should I have? That question is too crude. It leaves too much room for manipulation. Now let me bring everything together into one operating system, because the point of a good source document is not merely to say the article was too negative. It is to give you a better map. I call it the retirement checkpoint protocol. First, never accept a scary retirement model until you test whether the scenario itself is internally coherent. Second, identify whether the Social Security assumption actually matches the type of household being modeled. Third, stop treating retirement as one giant undifferentiated horizon. Break it into phases. Fourth, assign jobs to dollars. Bridge dollars are not longevity dollars. Fifth, model the gap after guaranteed income begins, not only the gross spending target before it. Sixth, think in spending ranges and flexibility, not in one rigid headline. Number 7, always ask whether the media is describing a real planning issue or manufacturing inadequacy for emotional effect. That is the protocol. And if you follow it, something very important happens. The fog lifts. You stop hearing $1.5 million is barely enough as though it were gospel. You start asking, enough for whom, at what age, under what bridge structure, with what Social Security, with what flexibility, and according to whose assumptions? That is a much better question. Now, let me tell you the harshest truth in the whole conversation. A lot of retirement media is not built to make you free. It is built to make you anxious. That does not mean every journalist is wicked. It means the emotional economy rewards fear, fear travels, fear sells, fear gets clicks, fear makes ordinary achievement feel insufficient. And insufficiency is a very profitable feeling, because a person who always feels behind can be sold almost anything. One more product, one more advisor, one more newsletter, one more strategy, one more reason not to stop working. That is why framing matters so much. The source closes in the right spirit. You have to run the numbers on your own situation, because the real picture may be much more achievable than the media headline suggests. Phyphilosite. Phyturn 54 file 0 Phy. Exactly. That is the cleanest truth here. Retirement is not impossible because an article managed to make $1.5 million sound weak. Retirement becomes impossible when you borrow someone else's fear and mistake it for your own plan. Do not do that. Do the harder thing. Build the plan. Break the years into phases. Estimate. Honestly, stay flexible. Respect the guaranteed income when it turns on. Respect the difference between a bridge problem and a lifetime problem. Respect the rarity of what you have already built. And most importantly, stop letting headlines move your finish line every time you get close to it. Because if you do not protect your mind from that, you can save brilliantly and still feel like a failure. That is one of the saddest outcomes in all of personal finance. A person wins the money game and loses the emotional one. I do not want that for anybody. So let me leave you with the clearest version of the whole argument. $1.5 million is not magic. Fine, no number is magic. But it is also not bare minimum, in any honest universal sense. Not for a household in the top slice of liquid wealth. Not when Social Security later turns on at a much higher level than the scare framing admitted. Not when retirement is broken into a 12-year bridge and then a later guaranteed income phase. Not when spending can be ranged rather than treated as a robotically fixed line forever. Not when flexibility exists. The real problem is not that $1.5 million is secretly tiny. The real problem is that a lot of retirement discourse has become addicted to moving the finish line because fear sounds smarter than possibility. I am not interested in that game. I am interested in honest math. And honest math says something much calmer for the right household. With the right sequence, $1.5 million at 55 can absolutely be enough to build a strong early retirement. Not effortless, not brainless, not guaranteed under every lifestyle fantasy, but real, achievable, structurable. And that matters because a realistic freedom is worth much more than a dramatic fear. The fear gets attention, the structure gets people retired. I know which one I would rather own.